the Y stole my promotion and gave me a dead vineyard instead. They had no idea what was buried under the vines. My name is Naomi, and I am 31 years old. I drained every cent I had saved in my entire adult life to buy 11 acres of dead drought-cracked vineyard that hadn't produced a single grape since 2009. The day I signed the papers, my mother told me I had officially thrown my future into a hole in the ground. My older brother didn't even bother hiding his laughter. He said I'd be back within a month, begging for my old desk. They thought they'd finally broken me, that pushing me out of the family business and watching me buy a worthless, dead vineyard was the end of my story. But 11 days later, what I found buried beneath those rotting vines didn't just save me. It put my entire family's future directly in my hands, and they had absolutely no idea. Before I get into it, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever worked yourself to the bone for a family that still treated you like an afterthought, hit subscribe, because what happens to my next is going to feel very, very satisfying. I grew up in a wine-growing valley in Central California in a family that had spent 3 generations building a respected mid-sized winery. My father, Walter, inherited the operation from his father and turned it into something serious. Distribution contracts, a tasting room that pulled in tourists from 3 counties, a name people actually recognized on store shelves. It was built on tradition, control, and an unspoken rule that ran through every dinner, every meeting, every holiday for as long as I could remember. My older brother Desmond was the future of the family name, and I was the labor that kept the lights on while he got ready to inherit it. For 4 years, I ran operations, not in title. Walter never gave me the title, but in practice. I restructured our entire distribution network after we lost 2 major retail contracts in the same quarter. I renegotiated supplier deals that were bleeding the company dry. I personally rebuilt our irrigation scheduling system after a drought year nearly wiped out half our yield, saving the company an amount of money that, when I finally said it out loud to my father, made even him go quiet for a second. I worked 60-hour weeks during harvest. I missed weddings. I missed my own birthday 2 years running because bottling never stops for anyone's calendar. My father had told me more than once, in writing even, that the general manager position was mine once our longtime GM retired. I had the emails. I had 3 years of performance reviews that used words like indispensable and essential. I believed foolishly that if I just worked hard enough, long enough, they would finally see me as something more than the quiet workhorse who made Desmond's life easier. But hard work was never the currency that mattered in my family. Image was. The betrayal happened at our annual investor dinner, the night we presented our 5-year growth plan to the regional distributors and 2 private investment groups who'd been circling our expansion for over a year. I had built that plan from scratch, every projection, every cost model, every slide. I'd spent 3 weeks barely sleeping to get it right because I knew this dinner was supposed to be the moment my father finally announced my promotion in front of people who mattered. Instead, my father stood up, thanked everyone for coming, and handed the floor to Desmond. My slides. My numbers. My 5-year plan, with my name quietly deleted from the footer and replaced with his. I sat there in a dress I'd bought specifically for that night, gripping a wine glass I never drank from, listening to my brother butcher the explanation of our own irrigation cost savings because he didn't actually understand the system I had built. He mispronounced the name of our biggest distributor. He called our cover crop strategy by the wrong term twice. And the investors nodded along anyway, charmed completely by his easy confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from never once being told no in your entire life. When he finished, my father stood beaming and announced that Desmond would officially be taking over as general manager effective immediately. The room applauded. I clapped too because I didn't know what else my hands were supposed to do. I cornered my father in his office afterward. I told him that was my plan, my work, my promotion that he had promised me in writing. He looked at me the way you'd look at an employee filing a minor complaint about the break room. He told me Desmond had the presence the company needed going into its next chapter, that I was better suited for the behind-the-scenes work, that I needed to stop being so emotional and think about what was good for the family. He said maybe we could talk about a raise. A raise. After 4 years and a promise in writing. That was the moment something in me went quiet and final. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I went home that night and, over the next several days, I quietly liquidated every investment account I had. I sold off the small amount of stock I'd built up over a decade of careful saving. I gathered every dollar to my name because I already knew exactly what I was going to do with it. I drove out past the edge of the valley, beyond the developed wine country everyone recognized, to a stretch of land that had been abandoned for over a decade. 11 acres of old vine rows, completely dead, the soil cracked and gray from years of drought and neglect. The previous owner, a reclusive old farmer named Elias, had died with no heirs, and the land had sat in legal limbo until the county finally cleared it for sale. Everyone in the valley considered it worthless, too far from the tourist routes, too damaged to replant without a fortune in restoration. I signed the deed anyway. I knew the soil composition in that stretch of valley better than most people knew their own backyards, because I'd spent 4 years studying every inch of land like it for my father's expansion plans. I had a theory about that dead plot, a theory nobody else had bothered to test. That Sunday, I went to the mandatory family dinner at the restaurant my family always chose to celebrate things. White tablecloths, a wine list curated by my father's Ito. Desmond was already 3 glasses in, loudly toasting his promotion. My mother sat beside him, glowing with pride she had never once shown me. I sat down, set my purse in my lap, and when my father started rattling off tasks he needed from me by Monday morning, I slid an envelope across the table instead. It was my resignation letter. The table went silent. My father's face went through several colors before settling on a dangerous shade of red. My mother gasped theatrically, more concerned with who at nearby tables might be watching than with anything I'd actually said. I reached into my purse a second time and placed the deed to the dead vineyard on top of the resignation letter. Desmond grabbed it before my father could. He read the address, and when he realized exactly which plot of land it was, he started laughing so hard he had to put his wine glass down. He told the whole table, loud enough for nearby diners to hear, that I'd just spent my entire life savings on a dead patch of dirt that even the county didn't want. He called it the most pathetic, desperate decision he'd ever seen me make, and he said I'd be crawling back to beg for my old job within a month, except there wouldn't be one waiting for me. My mother didn't defend me. She leaned in and told me, in a low, venomous voice, that I had embarrassed the family name and that she expected me to keep this humiliating little stunt to myself. My father delivered the final blow. He told me that if I wanted to play farmer with a worthless plot of dead vines, I'd do it completely on my own. He fired me on the spot, cut off my access to the family trust, and told me I was no longer welcome to consider myself part of the company's future. Desmond picked up the check that landed on the table moments later, slid it across to me with a smirk, and told me to consider it my first business expense as an independent woman. Them three of them stood up and left without another word. I sat there alone with a $310 bill and a checking account that, after the vineyard purchase, held just under $600. I paid it anyway, hands shaking, and made myself a quiet promise. They wanted me to fail. I was going to make them regret ever underestimating me. The next morning, I moved into a small camper trailer parked at the edge of my new property. There was no welcome committee. Just dead vines stretching out under a brutal sun, a falling down equipment shed, and silence. I spent the first week clearing decades of debris, rusted wire trellises, rotted fence posts, the kind of physical labor that leaves blisters on top of blisters. Every time I wanted to quit, I thought about Desmond's laugh at that dinner table, and I kept going. It was on the 8th day, while clearing out the old equipment shed to check the foundation for rot, that I found something strange behind a collapsed wall panel. A section of the back wall didn't sound right when I knocked on it. Hollow. I pried away the rotted wood paneling and found a sealed concrete chamber built into the hillside behind the shed, completely hidden, clearly constructed decades before by someone who didn't want it found casually. It took a locksmith and a full afternoon to get through the corroded steel door. What we found inside wasn't treasure in the way you'd expect. It was paperwork. Decades old, perfectly preserved hydrology surveys, water rights filings, and a hand-annotated map of the valley's underground aquifer system, all done by Elias himself back when he was working as an independent water surveyor before he ever owned this land. I spent 2 days going through every document with the same careful eye I'd used analyzing distribution contracts for my father's company, and what I found made my hands shake. Elias hadn't just owned this dead vineyard. Back in the early 90s, during a period when the county was desperate to offload unused agricultural land, he had quietly secured the exclusive water extraction rights for the entire underground aquifer beneath this section of the valley, rights that were explicitly tied to the deed of this specific parcel. Nobody had touched or contested them in over 30 years because nobody had any reason to. The land above was dead. Worthless. The valuable part was buried in legal language nobody had bothered to read, which meant I now controlled the single largest untapped water source in the entire valley. The same valley where my father's company had, just 6 months earlier, started quietly acquiring land for a massive new vineyard expansion that depended entirely on securing new irrigation access, because the county had recently restricted new water permits due to drought concerns. I sat in my camper trailer that night and started laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief more than joy. They had handed me the one piece of dead land in the entire valley that happened to hold the key to their entire expansion plan. I didn't tell anyone right away. I needed to understand exactly how valuable this was before I moved. I hired a water rights attorney named Priya, a sharp, no nonsense woman who specialized in agricultural land disputes and laid every document on her desk. She spent an entire day cross referencing county records, and when she finally looked up at me, she told me my family's expansion plan was, legally speaking, dead in the water unless they came to me first. She said most companies in their position would have done a basic title search before investing millions into expansion. She said the fact that they hadn't was either staggering arrogance or staggering carelessness. And in her experience with families like mine, it was usually both. I asked her what I should do with it. She smiled and told me that was entirely up to me, but that she'd be happy to make sure whatever I decided was completely airtight. 3 weeks later, my family hosted their own investor dinner to formally announce the expansion. I wasn't invited, obviously. But Priya was already prepared with a quiet legal notice that we filed the very same week, informing the county and any relevant stakeholders that the water extraction rights for that section of the aquifer belonged exclusively to me, and that any unauthorized drilling or extraction in that zone would result in immediate legal action. It didn't take long for Desmond to show up at my vineyard. He pulled up in an SUV that cost more than what I'd had left in my bank account after that first dinner, looking irritated at the dust on his shoes. He told me the family needed to discuss water access for the new expansion plots, and that he was prepared to offer me a small buyout for what he assumed were just nuisance mineral rights, a number that was almost insulting given what I now knew. I told him I wasn't selling anything. I told him to read the legal notice his own company's attorneys should have already received that morning. He didn't believe me until he called someone from the car, and I watched his face change in real time as whoever was on the other end confirmed exactly what Priya had filed. He didn't laugh that time. Over the following weeks, the pressure escalated exactly the way I expected it to. County inspectors started showing up at my property citing obscure code violations on a trailer and a half-collapsed shed nobody had bothered to inspect in over a decade. My access road suddenly needed emergency maintenance that conveniently blocked equipment deliveries. I documented every single visit, every inspector's badge number, every conveniently timed disruption because I'd learned enough from my years managing operations to know that paperwork is the only language people like my father actually respect. When the harassment didn't work, my mother showed up next, dressed for a tasting room appearance rather than a visit to a half-built vineyard. She told me I was having some kind of breakdown, that buying dead land and living in a trailer was beneath our family name, and that I needed to come home and let Desmond fix this misunderstanding by signing over the rights for a modest settlement. She acted as though the harassment campaign currently being run against me by my own family was a symptom of my instability rather than something they were actively orchestrating. I asked her calmly whether Walter's blood pressure had spiked before or after he sent inspectors to harass a woman living alone on 11 acres. She didn't have an answer. She just told me I was destroying the family and left. That was when I understood exactly why they were panicking. It wasn't really about the water, it was about the calendar. I found out, through a contact still working inside the company, that my family had already pre-sold expansion shares to investors based on projected yield from the new vineyard plots that physically could not be irrigated without access to that aquifer. They had marketed an expansion that legally could not exist without my signature, so I let Priya prepare something stronger, not a quiet settlement, a public one. My family was holding a formal groundbreaking ceremony for the new expansion, the kind with investors, local press, and a few county officials there to celebrate the valley's exciting new chapter. I showed up. Priya came with me carrying the folder that contained every relevant document, including a notarized copy of the original 1990s water rights filing. When my father saw me walking toward the small podium set up for the ceremony, his face went through the exact same transformation it had at that dinner table months earlier, except this time, there was no waiter to hand him a check and walk away from. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked in front of everyone holding a champagne glass how exactly they planned to irrigate the new expansion plots when the underlying water rights belonged entirely to me. Desmond tried to laugh it off in front of the investors, the same performative confidence he'd used to steal my 5-year plan months earlier. But Priya stepped forward and distributed copies of the filing to the investors standing closest to the podium, and I watched, in real time, the exact moment people holding significant money in this project realized they had backed an expansion that legally could not be completed. The investors didn't stay long after that. Within a week, Two of them formally withdrew funding. The local paper ran a story about the water rights complication threatening the valley's newest expansion. My father's company, the one that prided itself on 3 generations of careful tradition, was suddenly facing the very real possibility that the expansion would collapse before a single new vine went into the ground, taking a significant chunk of capital down with it. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Walter and Desmond showed up at my vineyard, not in anger this time, in quiet, exhausted defeat. My father told me they'd made a mistake. He said it the way you'd admit to a typo, not to years of disrespect. But I let it pass because I already knew what I wanted. I wasn't going to sell the rights. I told them that plainly. But I was willing to lease them under terms that Priya and I had already drafted weeks in advance because I'd known this conversation was coming the moment the investors first walked away. The lease gave them metered, restricted access to the aquifer for their expansion. In exchange, my new holding company would receive an ongoing percentage of gross revenue from the expansion plot specifically for as long as that water kept flowing. And the final condition, the one that made Desmond go pale standing right there in the dirt of the vineyard he'd mocked me for buying, was that he would step down from his general manager title and sign a non-compete preventing him from running a competing wine operation anywhere in the valley for the next decade. He looked at our father, waiting for someone to rescue him from that condition. Nobody did. Walter needed the water more than he needed to protect his son's ego. And in the end, that told me everything about where I had always actually ranked in that family's priorities, and everything about where Desmond did too the moment it became inconvenient. He signed. It's been 2 years now. My 11 acres of dead vines are gone, replaced by a small, carefully designed boutique winery and tasting room that sits at the only entrance point into my family's expansion. Every visitor heading toward their new vineyard passes through mine first. Every month, I receive a wire transfer that represents my share of an expansion I never had to manage, staff, or worry about. Because I own the one resource it can't survive without. I saw Desmond a few months ago, driving past my property in a much older car than the one he used to show up here in, looking like a man who'd learned exactly how little his father's protection was worth once it became expensive to give. I didn't feel triumphant watching him drive away. I just felt finished, done with a family that only ever valued me the moment I stopped needing their approval. They told me I'd thrown my future into a hole in the ground. They just never thought to ask what might be buried in it. If you've ever been counted out by the people who were supposed to believe in you the most, let me know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who end up needing you the most in the end.